I'll introduce Linda Tucci. She's a senior news writer for TechTarget's CIO sites. And TechTarget is really one of the kind of new media success stories here in Boston from the last 10 years or so. And on my left, you're right, Jill Hurst-Wall is an assistant professor of practice at Syracuse University School of Information Studies, and she's president of Hurst Associates, a firm that helps clients digitize analog assets. And so our goal kind of in this panel, in addition to taking a lot of questions and contributions from you, is I think we want to explore both the role that the professional media plays, if we can call ourselves professional, I guess, plays in highlighting important innovations and helping them kind of gain momentum. But also look at the ways that new social media tools and platforms are turning people inside organizations into communicators with a really big stage, and kind of how that's changing the game of communication around innovation. I think that really has been important. And I guess, Jill, I would ask you first, kind of on this social media front. Would you talk just a little bit about kind of when you think social media, which is a buzzword that kind of has been probably overused, over-applied, what's important to you about social media? Kind of what does it mean right now? And how is it changing the communication game?
What does it mean?
Yeah, the big picture. What does it mean to all of us as human beings?
So when I think of social media, I always use three words. I talk about social media connecting, sharing, and collaborating. And I really don't care, to some extent, what the technology is, as long as I can connect to people that I know or don't know. And to some regard, it's the people I don't know that give me the best information, that can share information really seamlessly and easily, whether it's from my iPhone or a laptop or whatever, and that can easily collaborate with other people. And so those are the three things I think about when I talk about social media. And it can be text, it can be photos, it can be video, it can be whatever else you want to do. Now I've forgotten the second part of the question.
I guess let me distract you a little bit and just ask, what are the social media tools, or which sites do you find yourself kind of using most often today in your daily life, either to kind of figure out what's going on out there, or to publish and kind of share information?
So I published I have two personal blogs, professional blogs that I've had. One is 6 years old, and so those are, I still believe heavily in blogging. I tweet, so I have been tweeting the conference. I use Flickr, FriendFeed, which is now owned by Facebook, and a great place for conversations, but not a place that really took off massively. It kind of, early adopters really adopted to it, probably everybody in San Francisco. And
yeah, I would use that as an example of one of those technologies that kind of doesn't get beyond the digerati circle.
That's right. And then probably at this point in my life, I said this to someone last night, I subscribe to hundreds of, well, not probably hundreds, 100 blogs that I should be reading. But what I pay attention to is Twitter. Mm-hmm. And so
you have RSS feeds for these 100 blogs that you maybe don't consult as often as you did a year or two ago.
Right. And so I ask questions in Twitter. I get advice in Twitter. If I don't know something, I'll ask people on Twitter. If something important happens, I find out on Twitter. And so that's really the place that's keeping me up to date on my area of expertise.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, Linda, I'd ask you the same question in terms of like what strikes you as the big impact circa March of 2010 of social media, and what are some of the tools that you are using?
I'd sort of like to set the context for my reporting. As Scott said, I cover chief information officers, and my audience are chief information officers. I was a business reporter for 25 years, but for the past 5 years, I've really been concentrating on the relation of businesses and how businesses deal with information and information technology. And there is probably no part in the world in general, and certainly at companies in particular, that has changed more than the information management and the information systems of companies. And so for CIOs, innovation is less what you talked about in your presentation, this sort of eureka, aha, I have a great idea moment, than almost standard operating procedure, because information technology is changing so much. And in fact, innovation is a very mundane part of CIOs' lives. They deal with innovation every single day. And their biggest problem, at least from my reporting, is not so much getting their ideas about innovation out to the general public, and social media is important internally, but really communicating IT innovation internally to their, not only to their staffs, but to their business peers. And my own ideas about innovation have really changed from the sort of back to the future idea of, again, this sort of moment of artistic brilliance or a moment of scientific revelation, to really something that is more of a process. And what I'm seeing in companies, and whether they're successful or not, is that companies are starting to look at innovation as more of a process, and kind of dividing innovation into categories. And I bring this up because each category of innovation seems to require a different kind of communication. And so I don't have to do that now, but what I'd like to do is just briefly go through the three categories of innovation that I see in corporate America and in the corporate world, and then the different kinds of communication.
Can I ask you a question before you do that, which is, what do you see, I haven't been paying much attention to this, and maybe some of you have been seeing examples that you would want to share, but just in that internal sphere, there's lots of talk about enterprise social media and trying to do the same kinds of sharing things that, that Facebook does on the inside of companies. But so how are these CIOs actually spreading the gospel inside the organization? I mean, is it still kind of just an internal blog, or are there some other new ways?
Some CIOs are pretty slow to that game. I mean, I have resisted, and I think when a few years ago, when wikis were being built spontaneously and without IT's permission, there was a great deal of consternation that IT was losing the control of information in the company. And I think CIOs have many of them have rather slowly come around to this, to see that these are really great collaboration tools. And I mean, any of you who use SharePoint and know that SharePoint is Microsoft's biggest selling product right now, understand that this is...
So it's a horrible product.
It's a horrible product.
Microsoft, not a sponsor.
Yeah, it's okay. Let's loose the cannons.
So I used SharePoint with a class last semester, and SharePoint is really for document management, but they added on these social tools, so you can build a wiki, you can have blogs, you can have a discussion area, there's a calendar function, there's an announcement function, and even though I will tell you the class was very successful and the students learned a lot, and we used SharePoint, and students learned how to use SharePoint in the context of a class on digital libraries, it's not intuitive. It's not easy. Someone really has to spend time setting it up to build the structure, and it's almost like SAP, where it's flexible concrete. So it's flexible until you put it down, and then you kind of go, oh, I want to change it. It doesn't work well with a Mac. There's some other issues with it. You really need to be on IE, not Firefox. And
so not a fan of the SharePoint.
Maybe this is why
therapy. Let it out. Let it out.
It actually fits into that my second level or category of innovation, where you're changing the way a business works.
Yeah, give us your three.
I'll give you my
three categories.
So, like at the lowest level, and usually the least expensive, but not always, it sometimes requires the least effort, is a category that I call, and sometimes CIOs refer to as new to you, new to them. So it's you bring in a new technology, or you switch to a technology to gain some advantages, but it's not anything new in the world or new to other companies. It's sort of innovation by replacement. And I mean, Gmail would be a good example. I actually interviewed a lot of companies this year looking for cost savings that had moved from, in one case, Lotus Notes to Gmail. Not anything new out in the world, but new for that particular company. I cover disaster recovery. So a lot of companies took advantage of the slowdown to put in a disaster recovery plan, thank God, for their companies. Not new to the world, and not new to big companies, but new to them. Mm-hmm. So innovation by replacement. And then the second category is maybe related to to SharePoint, and it's really much harder. It takes a good deal more effort, a good deal more grunt work, and that is the sort of innovation where you are changing the way the business works. So you think of businesses that have a pipeline of information. Part of the information is done by computers. Part of the information is done by humans, maybe some of the information is off-site, and someone gets the idea that you want to, I mean, this is what IT has been doing in its history, is to put it all on a digital conveyor belt. But that's very hard to do, because even with off-the-shelf software, there's so much uniqueness to your company. Your data is so particular that you really have to understand it well enough. I mean, the cloud is a good example. Everyone wants to sort of explore how can we use the cloud to our advantage, but your data is so particular that you have to go to the work of figuring out how you can do it. And I don't have to get into the details of privacy issues and things, but
let me just stop for a second. So the one thing about SharePoint, and it's one of many enterprise social media software, is that people say, oh, I have Microsoft, so I'll get SharePoint, rather than saying I have a need, and what fulfills the need.
Yeah, I think my sense is that happens a lot in kind of corporate technology buying.
And that is hard, because you have this legacy technology, and you figure, how can we leverage it to do something new? And oftentimes
you have a preferred vendor.
Yeah, and you have a preferred vendor that's giving you some perks, and you'd be paying you to talk to employees about how great it is.
Do you have an incumbent vendor, you don't have a preferred vendor.
Linda, do you ask people when you're talking to them whether they're, I mean, because there's this interesting thing with writing about technology where you assume something has happened. If you ask Microsoft or you ask Oracle or whoever, I'd love to talk to a CIO or a user of this technology, and they say, here's our list of 3 users that you can talk to. Do you tend to ask them, those users, like, did you get the technology for free? What was the deal between you and Oracle, you and Microsoft?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to ask that. And then the other thing I do, kind of off the topic, is that I always use the opportunity to talk about something else. What are you doing? What new things do you have going? What's the top of your agenda? What's your biggest pain point? And I don't feel any compulsion to listen to their song and dance about the particular. And often I even ask, I'll talk to your customer, but I want to talk to your customer not with 10 PR people on the line. Give his or her information, and I'm going to call.
But what do you find when you ask about the ties to the vendor? I mean, do they disclose, what's a,
Some of them actually disclose.
The free golf clubs.
Yeah, some of them actually disclose what discount they get for talking to the media. But I mean, the bigger point to make with this sort of innovation, where you're changing the way the business does work, is that it requires, in terms of communication, again, we're talking about internal communication, not so much selling the idea, which is really the critical communication skill you need for that lower level, we're going to make a change type of technology, and really listening to people. I mean, the guy or the woman who's doing a process by writing something down on paper is not going to tell the CIO or the enterprise architect or the IT department how to put that information on their digital conveyor belt. Your IT department and the CIO has to be able to elicit enough information to understand the details well enough, and maybe you can speak with us, to capture those details so that they can actually build this transformative process. And I mean, some of these second level innovations are huge projects. I was just talking to the CIO at Amtrak, and at Amtrak they refer to little t transformation and big T transformation, the little t being that first category I talked about.
one that integrates innovative companies the fastest. Why don't you amplify a little bit on that?
What company is that? Sorry.
Is that Oracle?
Yeah, Oracle.
He's not sure who to say.
Bill's been bought by so many people.
No, Oracle buys about 60 companies a year, and I think the challenge any company has as a startup is that it's becoming increasingly harder to sell your product into CIOs, because CIOs would prefer buying from Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, and IBM. And so that creates a sort of a natural short life cycle where companies get acquired by companies like Oracle. And in some cases, they unlock the innovation within the company. In some cases, they stifle it. And I think that should be a concern to people who are looking at. I know that's a concern of yours, Scott, because we talked about that before. That many of the innovators end up being part of a large company before they have a chance to unlock their innovation to large corporations. The one that Tim talked about in DeMonica's case, I think it was an example where after Oracle acquired that company, the revenues of that company went up by a factor of 10, not because of anything new the company was doing from a product standpoint, but just because it was Oracle, and Oracle had 18,000 salespeople, and I had 4, and mine were pretty good, but they had 18,000.
Yeah.
And 4 years later, 100% of the people have been retained there. People have left, actually came back after Oracle acquired it. All the customers were retained. So it would be one that would be, I think, a good success story.
But there's a powerful subliminal message there. I mean, because and it goes back to the CIO's actually the role as to whether they were perpetuated. I mean, because if the CIO actually thinks now it's okay to buy DeMontra because Oracle bought them, there is something tragically wrong with that thinking. I mean,
The two things I would put out maybe as hypotheses. One is that I think sort of the crowdsourcing idea with things like incentive of saying, we're a company, we're working on this problem, we'd like to crack, a particular kind of, drug targeting problem in pharmaceuticals, or we'd like to crack sort of, what's the right communications protocol to use with this new wireless product, and opening that up to the world and turning it into a competition, I actually think is like one of the giant communication shifts that we're seeing. And so up to this point, it's really only been a few companies that have been willing to like do the incentive thing, and because it's that fear of like, well, if we share this information, will it give others an advantage in knowing that we're working on? But I think that thing, that shift is really big, the willingness to crowdsource and to open up. And Bill Taylor, author, Fast Company co-founder, has this incredible story in his book Mavericks at Work about this gold mine in Canada that just decided to open source all the information about where they had tried to mine and hadn't found gold and what they found instead. And just say to the world's scientists, the world's geologists, help us find gold and we'll give you a prize. They did it because they had nothing to lose. They just had been unsuccessfully mining this land, but it really turned the company around. And the other thing I would say is just, that I do think blogging and social media have forced, maybe it's more small and medium-sized companies, to communicate more about what they're working on earlier than they would have. In the old press release world, it was like, when the product is finished, we put out a press release and we tell the world, like, hey, it's here, you can now buy it.
And I think with people they might not ordinarily have been talking to. And
Yeah.
that's what I think you find in these big sort of innovations, is they come about by talking to people you wouldn't ordinarily talk to, by being out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I think, but I would really be curious to hear from people who are in, at Oracle and in the corporate world, how much corporations are trying to institutionalize innovation and what sort of structures they're putting in place to do this, because I do think there's a big push in corporations to make this a process that they can repeat.
Okay, yeah.
That's a question I had. I mean, open book management has been a best practice for a long time, and yet very few companies do it. And I can remember a similar story to your one with Corning. In the middle of my career, for 11 years, I worked at Harvard. And I remember one fall, when the students came back, there were no IBM computers to be had for students that wanted to buy them. And I found out later from a friend of mine who worked at IBM that the department that handled the parts to build computers won a Baldrige Award that year for keeping inventories really low. Okay, a classic example of goal incongruence. And I'm sure that the senior management wasn't aware that both of those things were happening, much like the metal-clad pans. Are any companies using this to kind of get that kind of feedback from employees to the top of the organization that they can see where inconsistencies are happening? Because that would seem like a real good use of social media internally.
I mean, I've heard Verizon talk about this a lot. They were, even 5 years ago when I first started covering this, they were one of the first companies that was on kind of the lecture circuit, the Forrester, Gardner conference circuit, to talk about the establishment of wikis, mashups, how every top person in the company can communicate with anybody else in the company. And I don't remember the details, but the great sort of serendipity and breakthroughs that this, and prevention of mistakes that this had resulted in. They did it through instituting lots and lots of wikis, requiring instant message so everyone is available at every time, and then sort of a bulletin board where people post what they're working on, and they say, I need an expert in wherever part of the company to help me on this particular problem. And so there's
But that's an interesting problem, because you have to have someone stand up and say, we won an award for this, but it's really stupid. And
the emperor has no clothes. Yeah.
And that's like a career killer. I would
well,
say.
but if you're really practicing open book management, you're looking at the overall, advantages and overall success of the organization. You think that way rather than thinking in a compartmentalized way. And in large organizations, often that's their downfall.
They have to have people at the top who really value that one person standing up and saying, you're really insane, would you stop doing this?
And I think a lot of times it becomes just a scale issue of, when you open yourself up to, to comments, to tweets, to instant messages, I think you're likely to be overwhelmed, and then it becomes what's signal and what's noise here. What's just sort of the venting and criticism versus what someone really, having an emperor has no clothes message to give you. I think we're just about out of time.
Yep,
I want to
5 minutes.
keep running on schedule. I mean, the one thing that I wanted to bring up that we discussed kind of going into this session was just, I feel like there's still a dearth of, I think maybe Jill, you brought this up, the dearth of like the ability to explain in plain English what your product or your service is going to do for people. Maybe that's like such a holy grail of communications, but
so can you do it in...
like that we all talk to experts and we talk to people inside the company so much that when you have to talk to the outside world and explain, here's what we've done, here's how it's going to impact you.
And the fact that you need to do that now, not in a long press release, but you need to be able to explain what you do or what that new thing is in 140 characters. And, or have it repeatable in 140 characters. And that's not what we were taught to do in school. We were taught to be long-winded. We were taught to be flowery. When we do press releases ideally are one page, but there's a lot of context in that one page. And so how do you boil that down to 140 characters? I know of a marketing person who says that you should be able to do it in 3 words. So how do you boil down your message to be so succinct and so understandable that you can push it out, people understand it, and are willing to then push out even further.
Yeah, so that telephone game of repeatability.
Isn't there also the question of who are you tailoring your message for? Because in this innovation group, like you earlier, all the entrepreneurs in this space who have been in the technology side have been held hostage by the analyst community, right? Or the Walt Mossbergs, because you got to, basically hump his leg or something. I want these 4 words in here, right? So you actually see this almost like if you will, lingual aerodynamics, where everybody starts sounding the same in a market space, because the Uber analyst at Gartner, or the Uber analyst at Portner, and the Uber, and Walt says this is important, right? And it comes together, and I think that we're going the wrong way on that, because who voted for these guys?
Yeah, but I think one of the problems there is that you have to sort of not take your understanding from the outside.
Yeah.
The first rule of communication is that you have to understand what you're talking about thoroughly, no bluff. And if you really believe in your heart and soul that this is an innovation that is worth doing, it's much easier to communicate it. And then, the second rule is you communicate in the vocabulary of your audience, and this is very tough to do. You communicate in a vocabulary that is more comfortable to them than it is to you, and that may require a lot of research on your part.
Well, it is, but it's a condemnation, I think, of PR everywhere, right? Because we've outsourced to people who don't understand. They don't understand the innovator, right, and are alingual when it comes to talking to the community.
But one of the things that we don't do very well in business is to communicate the so what.
Yeah,
so
what are you trying to achieve?
So I've created this great new product for you, so what? And going back to range toppers, the so what was it heated evenly, blah, blah, blah. People who cooked, who had cooking ware already, would understand that. Lousy innovation, but it was a message that you could communicate. We're not generally good at communicating the so what to our consumers.
I think that's true, and I think that a lot of innovation, a lot of communication, whether it's internal or external, wouldn't pass the cocktail party test of could you explain it in 2 minutes or less and have any random person at a cocktail party understand what you do, what you're trying to do, what change you're trying to affect.
Right.
I think the goal should be 100% transmission, but if you think about all the seminars and talks that you've been to, how much transmission do you get? It's usually maybe 10% or 20%, and just think about that from your audience's or your CEO's point of view, that everything you said in that hour could have been boiled down to 6 minutes. So, what you just told him or her is a colossal waste of time, and if you can get to that 100% transmission, I think you have a much better chance of selling and communicating your idea.
So I think one last comment over there.
So related to positioning, people often confuse positioning. They sort of think about how they want to be perceived, or how the company wants to be perceived. And what's most important is kind of your end user or your consumer or your customer, what's in the front of their gray matter? What do they think? And I think the simplest way to think about it is taking your pencil into my prior life and my current life. This is how I'm thinking about it. I call it me Tarzan, you Jane. And then grab your pencil like this, grab it, and if you can write your name like this on a whiteboard, and simply communicate. And that's not because people are stupid, it's because a lot of stuff comes across the transom, and the signal-to-noise ratio is really poor. What ends up happening is people don't understand what it is they're trying to do. So the idea of me Tarzan, you Jane, grabbing something and writing it simple, what does it do for them? I think people really lose that perspective, because especially in IT. I came from the application space, and now I've moved into the infrastructure space, and I can tell you this. Everybody says they want it simpler. And then I sit in the first couple of meetings and I talk to go to conferences, and it's alphabet soup. And I think because people are afraid of being seen as not being smart.
Yeah.
And it's got to be perceived the opposite, which is you got to make it simple enough so that everybody can understand. And I think that's,
Yeah. Great note to end on. Thank you.
Yes,
John.
thank you very much. Thank you. This round of applause for